The telephone's shrill ring cut through the pre-dawn silence like a blade. Hauptmann Franz Hartmann jolted awake in his narrow bunk at Creel Airfield. The voice on the other end was tense, urgent. Invasion forces, Normandy coastline. Every available fighter needed immediately. His feet hit the cold floor before he was fully conscious. June 6, 1944. 4:15 in the morning. The darkness outside his window was absolute. This was it. The moment every German pilot had been preparing for. The day that would determine everything. Hartmann pulled his flight jacket over his shoulders. The leather was worn soft from countless missions. He ran toward the dispersal area. His boots echoed against concrete. His Focke-Wulf 190 waited in the shadows, sleek metal gleaming under scattered lights. Other pilots emerged from their quarters like ghosts, faces pale in the dim light, eyes wide with that familiar mixture of excitement and terror. This was the invasion everyone had talked about. The massive assault German High Command had promised to repel. But something was wrong. Hartmann could sense it before he reached his aircraft. The ground crew chief stepped into his path. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt had served at Creel for 2 years. His expression stopped Hartmann cold. That look meant trouble, serious trouble. Herr Hauptmann, we have a situation. Hartmann's stomach clenched. His mouth went dry. What kind of situation? Fuel, sir. The two words hung in the cold air. They seemed to echo off the concrete. Fuel, the lifeblood of any air force. We received enough for 6 aircraft, maybe 8 if we don't top off the tanks completely. The words hit like physical blows. Hartmann stared at Schmidt. This had to be some kind of mistake, some administrative error that could be corrected with a phone call. He looked across the airfield. 18 Focke-Wulf 190s sat in their protective revetments, each one a masterpiece of German engineering. Sleek fighters with powerful engines, advanced weapon systems, some of the finest aircraft in the world, all of them silent, all of them grounded. 18 aircraft, Hartmann said slowly. Fuel for 6. Yes, sir. How is that possible? We're at full alert status. This is the invasion. Schmidt's weathered face showed no emotion. He'd learned not to waste energy on things beyond his control. We requested full allocation 3 days ago, sir. The fuel trucks never arrived. Why not? Command says the rail yards at Creel were bombed yesterday. Heavy damage. The fuel shipment from Leuna never left the synthetic plant. And, sir? Schmidt's voice dropped lower. I'm hearing similar reports from other airfields. The scope of the disaster began to register. This wasn't just Creel. This was systematic, widespread. What about Beauvais? Fuel for 10 aircraft, maybe 12. Evreux? 5 aircraft, sir, possibly fewer. Hartmann walked back toward the operations building. His mind raced through calculations. Each step felt heavier than the last. Intelligence had warned them about the invasion fleet. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of troops, massive air cover, and Germany's response would be what? 50 fighters? 60, if every base in France scraped together their last reserves? The operations room buzzed with activity. Radio operators hunched over their equipment. Officers clustered around maps. Static crackled from multiple receivers. Fragmentary reports filtered in from reconnaissance flights. Large naval formations confirmed off Normandy coast. Paratroopers landing near Carentan. Heavy bombing of coastal positions ongoing. Major Hartmann stood at the central map table. His face had turned ashen gray. He'd been on the telephone with Luftwaffe 3 headquarters for 20 minutes. When he finally hung up, silence filled the room like poison gas. Gentlemen, he said quietly. His voice barely carried across the room. Luftwaffe 3 has 319 operational aircraft available across all of France this morning. Someone laughed. A short, bitter bark of sound. 319. Against what everyone knew would be the largest amphibious operation in human history. Sir? Hartman said carefully. Allied strength estimates? Major Hartman looked at him with something approaching pity. Current intelligence suggests 10 to 15,000 aircraft based in England. The room absorbed this information in complete silence. Every pilot had known the Allies possessed numerical superiority. That wasn't news. But the actual scale of the disparity was staggering, impossible to fully comprehend. For every German fighter that managed to get airborne, there would be 40 or 50 Allied aircraft in the sky. The mathematics were overwhelming, crushing, hopeless. "The fuel situation?" another pilot asked. His voice was carefully controlled. "Is it temporary? Can we expect resupply today?" Major Hartman shook his head slowly. "The synthetic fuel plants have been under sustained bombardment since May. Luna, our largest facility, is operating at less than 10% capacity. The attacks on Ploesti and Romania have eliminated that supply entirely." He paused, rubbed his forehead with one hand. "And even if fuel was being produced, our transportation network is so damaged we can't move it effectively." The briefings from recent months suddenly made terrible sense. The warnings had been there. The implications had been discussed. But somehow the full scope of the catastrophe hadn't registered. In March 1944, Germany had been producing roughly 180,000 tons of aviation fuel monthly. That was barely adequate for operational needs. But it was sustainable. Then the American 8th Air Force and RAF had begun systematic attacks on synthetic fuel production. The strikes had been devastatingly effective, precise, relentless. By June, monthly production had collapsed to 56,000 tons, less than one-third of the previous output, and the bombing campaign was intensifying daily. Intelligence projections suggested that by autumn, production might fall below 20,000 tons per month. 20,000 tons. A single fighter squadron conducting intensive operations could burn through 100 tons of fuel in 1 week. The entire Luftwaffe, operating at full capacity, would exhaust Germany's monthly fuel production in less than 5 days. It was an equation with no solution, a mathematical impossibility. "Sir," Hartman addressed Major Hartman, "even if we get aircraft airborne this morning, what happens tomorrow? Next week?" The major met his eyes directly. "That's the question Berlin refuses to answer. We have aircraft. We have pilots, though not enough. What we don't have is fuel to fly them." "The enemy knows this," Oberleutnant Richter said bitterly. "That's why they're invading now. They've been tracking our fuel situation. They know we can't defend the airspace effectively." It was absolutely true. Allied intelligence had been intercepting German communications about fuel shortages for months. They had watched the synthetic fuel plants burn. They had calculated correctly that the Luftwaffe was being systematically starved of its operational capability. Hartman walked to the window. Dawn was beginning to break over the airfield. The sky showed pale streaks of gray and orange. Somewhere beyond the western horizon, the greatest invasion force in history was approaching the French coastline. And he, a fighter pilot in one of the Luftwaffe's supposedly elite squadrons, could do absolutely nothing. He was a spectator to his own defeat. At 5:30 in the morning, the final orders arrived by telephone. Major Hartman gathered the available pilots around the operations table. His voice was steady, but hollow. "We're launching 6 aircraft. First Staffel, you're designated for the mission. Your objective is reconnaissance and harassment of Allied air operations over the invasion beaches." He paused, met each pilot's eyes in turn. "You are not, I repeat, not to engage unless you have an overwhelming tactical advantage. Your primary mission is observation and reporting." The unspoken reality settled over everyone present. 6 German fighters against what intelligence now confirmed were thousands of Allied aircraft. This wasn't a combat mission. It was a symbolic gesture, a desperate attempt to prove the Luftwaffe hadn't completely abandoned the battlefield. Hartman would not be flying. His Staffel was being held in reserve. though for what purpose nobody could articulate. He walked outside to watch the 6 Focke-Wulf 190s taxi toward the runway. Good pilots, every one of them. Men he had trained alongside, flown combat missions with, shared drinks with in the officers' mess during better times. He wondered how many would return from this impossible mission. The aircraft engines roared to life. Propellers spun into invisible blur discs. One by one, they accelerated down the concrete runway. Landing gear retracted. They lifted into the pale morning sky and banked west toward Normandy. Within minutes, they had disappeared. 6 tiny specks vanishing into the vast emptiness above. And then Creel Airfield fell silent again. 12 Focke-Wulf 190s remained in their revetments, fully armed, perfectly maintained, completely useless. Hartman stood on the tarmac, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. For the first time in his military career, he felt utterly powerless, defeated not by enemy skill or courage, but by industrial mathematics. "It's not supposed to be like this," Schmidt said quietly beside him. The ground crew chief's voice carried decades of aviation experience. "We're supposed to be the best air force in the world, most advanced fighters, superior training, and we're grounded because we don't have fuel." Hartman had no answer. What could he say? Schmidt was absolutely correct. The Luftwaffe possessed excellent aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190 was superior to most Allied fighters in many measurable ways. German pilots, even young ones with limited experience, often maintained tactical advantages in specific combat situations. But none of that mattered if aircraft couldn't leave the ground. Technical superiority meant nothing without operational fuel. Training meant nothing without practice flights. Experience meant nothing without combat opportunities. At 6:15, the first reconnaissance reports began filtering in from the few aircraft that had managed to get airborne. What they described exceeded everyone's worst expectations. The English Channel was completely covered with ships. Not hundreds, not thousands. Nearly 7,000 vessels of every conceivable type. And above this massive fleet, filling the entire sky like metallic insects, were Allied aircraft. Fighters providing air cover in multiple layers. Medium bombers striking coastal defenses systematically. Heavy bombers pulverizing German positions miles inland. Transport aircraft towing gliders packed with paratroopers. The radio operator in the operations room transcribed messages as they arrived. His handwriting grew increasingly shaky with each transmission. Observer reports estimate 500-plus Allied aircraft visible from single observation point. No Luftwaffe aircraft observed over invasion beaches. Allied fighters operating in squadron strength at all altitude levels. Request immediate air support. The final line was devastating. Enemy air superiority absolute. Absolute air superiority. The Allies owned the sky so completely that German ground forces were requesting assistance they knew couldn't arrive. The radio operators kept transmitting desperate pleas into empty air. Hartman listened to these reports with growing certainty. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The outcome had been determined not by tactics or individual courage, but by industrial production capacity, by oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants, by the bomber streams that had methodically destroyed Germany's energy infrastructure. At 7, one of the 6 launched fighters returned in emergency condition. Landing gear extended early, hydraulic fluid streaming from severed lines. The aircraft was riddled with holes from anti-aircraft fire. The pilot, Lieutenant Becker, was uninjured physically, but as ground crew pulled him from the cockpit, his hands shook uncontrollably. Not from wounds, but from what he had witnessed over Normandy. "There are so many of them," he said. His voice sounded hollow, distant. "The sky is completely black with their aircraft. I counted 50 fighters in a single formation. 50. And that was just one formation among dozens." He looked at Hartman with haunted eyes. "Sir, I saw their ships. You cannot count them. The ocean is solid steel from horizon to horizon. And above it all, their aircraft. Everywhere you look. Everywhere. His voice dropped to a whisper. Sir, we cannot fight this. There is no way to fight this. What Hartmann and his fellow pilots couldn't fully understand was that D-Day wasn't the beginning of the decisive battle. The decisive battle had already been fought and lost in May 1944, over German industrial centers, in the skies above synthetic fuel plants. Between May and June, American and British bombers had flown thousands of sorties against Germany's oil infrastructure. The target list read like a catalog of industrial destruction. Luna, the massive synthetic fuel complex, had been hit repeatedly with devastating precision. Politz, Merseburg, Brucks, Gelsenkirchen. Every major fuel production facility had been systematically struck. The attacks had been coordinated and relentless. Intelligence reports later intercepted by the Allies confirmed the catastrophic damage. A memorandum from Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, to Hitler painted a picture of complete industrial collapse. The attacks in May and June have reduced aviation fuel output by 90%. It would require 6 to 8 weeks to make minimal repairs for resumed production. But unless these refineries are protected by all possible means, coverage of the most urgent military requirements can no longer be assured. 90%. In 2 months, the Allies had essentially eliminated the Luftwaffe's fuel supply. And the genius of this campaign lay in its cascading effects. Without fuel, German fighters couldn't intercept Allied bombers effectively, which meant Allied bombers could strike with greater impunity, which meant more fuel plants destroyed, which meant even less available fuel. It was a death spiral. And by June 6th, it was essentially complete. Hartmann knew none of these specific strategic details. But he understood the operational reality perfectly. Schmidt had mentioned that fuel trucks hadn't arrived from Luna. What he hadn't known was that Luna had been struck by 935 heavy bombers on May 12th. That single massive raid had destroyed over 80% of the plant's production capacity. And it had been hit again on May 28th, and again on May 29th. The fuel that was supposed to keep Creel Airfield operational simply no longer existed. It was burning in the rubble of industrial Germany. Even if the fuel situation had somehow been resolved, the Luftwaffe faced another equally catastrophic problem: trained pilots. The same strategic bombing campaign that had destroyed fuel production had also been systematically eliminating German fighter pilots. In the 5 months before D-Day, the Luftwaffe had lost over 2,000 fighter pilots. Not aircraft. Pilots. 2,000 trained aviators, dead or permanently disabled. Training adequate replacements required 18 months under peacetime conditions. But these weren't peacetime conditions. The pilot training program itself was being crippled by fuel shortages. New pilots were receiving 60 hours of training in operational aircraft, compared to 225 hours for Allied pilots. 60 hours was barely sufficient to master basic flight operations, let alone combat tactics. And even this drastically reduced training program was being systematically gutted. Over 80 experienced flight instructors had been pulled from training units and thrown into frontline squadrons to fill gaps created by combat casualties. So new pilots were being trained by less experienced instructors, for fewer hours, in aircraft that often lacked fuel for adequate practice flights. The result was predictable and tragic. New pilots arrived at operational squadrons with minimal flying skills. They survived an average of fewer than 10 combat sorties before being killed or wounded, which meant training centers had to produce even more replacement pilots, which strained fuel allocation further, which reduced training quality even more, which led to higher casualty rates. Another death spiral, running parallel to the fuel crisis. Hartmann had witnessed this firsthand. 2 months earlier, his staffel had received 3 replacement pilots fresh from training school. Eager young men, terrified but determined. Within 3 weeks, all 3 were dead. one shot down by American P-51 Mustangs on his second combat mission. One crashed during landing after ground fire damaged his aircraft's hydraulic system. One simply disappeared during a routine patrol. His fate remained unknown. They had been good young men. They had done their absolute best. But their best wasn't remotely adequate against Allied pilots with 10 times their training hours and combat experience. By mid-morning on June 6th, situation reports from Normandy painted a picture of complete Allied air domination. The Luftwaffe's entire effort for the day would total approximately 300 sorties across all of France. 300. The Allies, by contrast, flew 14,674 sorties on D-Day alone. 14,674. The numerical disparity was so extreme it became almost meaningless. Human minds aren't equipped to process that kind of mathematical difference. It was like comparing a candle flame to the sun, and the impact on German ground forces was devastating beyond description. German soldiers dug into defensive positions along the Normandy coast had zero air cover. They looked up and saw nothing but Allied aircraft, American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, British Spitfires and Hawker Typhoons, medium bombers systematically destroying their positions, heavy bombers turning the landscape into moonscape craters, transport aircraft bringing continuous reinforcements and supplies. One intercepted German radio message captured the complete desperation. Request immediate air support. Under continuous aerial bombardment. Cannot maintain positions without fighter cover. The response from Luftwaffe Command was heartbreaking in its honesty. No air support available. All aircraft committed elsewhere. Hold your positions as long as possible. No air support available. Perhaps the most devastating words any soldier can hear during combat. And it was accurate across the entire invasion front. From Utah Beach to Sword Beach, German defenders were being hammered from above with no means of retaliation. Later, German soldiers would develop bitter humor about their situation. If you see silver aircraft, they're American. If you see camouflaged aircraft, they're British. If you see no aircraft at all, that's the Luftwaffe. It was gallows humor, but it captured a fundamental truth about the situation. The Luftwaffe had become essentially invisible, not because its pilots lacked courage, not because its aircraft lacked capability, but because it lacked the fuel necessary to fly. By early afternoon, reports from the invasion front confirmed Allied success. American and British troops were pushing steadily inland from the beaches. German counterattacks were being systematically destroyed by Allied air power before they could reach the fighting. At Kreil Airfield, Hartmann and his fellow pilots sat in the ready room listening to radio reports. Unable to help, unable to participate, unable to influence events in any meaningful way. 3 of the 6 aircraft launched that morning had failed to return. One was confirmed shot down by American fighters over the invasion beaches. One was missing, presumably crashed or destroyed. One had landed at another airfield with severe battle damage and insufficient fuel to return to Kreil. Of the 3 aircraft that had made it back to base, 2 were damaged and would require extensive repairs before flying again. 6 sorties launched. 3 aircraft lost or rendered inoperative. And what had they accomplished? They had observed the invasion. They had confirmed what everyone already knew. The Allies were landing in overwhelming force. German defenders were fighting with desperate courage but being overwhelmed by sheer material superiority. And the Luftwaffe was powerless to intervene meaningfully. "We should have scraped together fuel for all 18 aircraft," one pilot said bitterly. "At least we could have made some kind of real effort." Major Hartmann shook his head slowly. "And then what? Tomorrow we would have 0 aircraft available. At least this way we maintain some minimal operational capability." But his voice carried no conviction. Everyone present understood the truth. It didn't matter whether they flew 6 aircraft today and 6 tomorrow, or 12 aircraft today and none tomorrow. The fundamental mathematics remained inexorable. Germany had lost the air war months before D-Day began. not through lack of courage or skill, but through industrial attrition. The Allies had systematically destroyed the infrastructure that made air operations possible. And without that infrastructure, all the courage and skill in the world meant nothing. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Radio reports continued arriving from Normandy. Each one confirmed the same basic reality. Allied forces were establishing permanent footholds on French soil. German resistance was fierce, but ultimately futile without air support, and the Luftwaffe remained grounded, watching, listening, unable to affect the outcome of the most important battle of the war. The Allies possessed such crushing dominance that whether the Luftwaffe showed up or stayed home meant absolutely nothing. The outcome would remain identical. These German pilots had become mere observers. They watched their own destruction unfold like spectators at a theater. At 3 in the afternoon, fresh orders came through. The message crackled over radio communications. Static filled the air between words. The entire wing faced immediate relocation. Allied reconnaissance had most likely pinpointed Kriel as an operational Luftwaffe installation. This identification carried a death sentence. Bombing raids would follow within hours, maybe days at most, but they would come with certainty. Orders demanded movement to a dispersal field deeper inland. Every piece of movable equipment required packing. Everything else needed destruction. Nothing could remain for enemy use. They would operate with even fewer resources than their current meager supplies. This pattern defined the Luftwaffe throughout 1944. Endless retreats followed by more retreats. Capabilities shrunk daily. Fighting spirit remained strong, but fighting ability withered. Victory was no longer the goal. Survival through another sunrise became the only objective. Hartmann watched his men prepare for this latest evacuation. His mind wandered to a conversation from months earlier. An older pilot had shared wisdom that day. This veteran carried scars from campaigns across France and the Eastern Front. His words echoed now with terrible clarity. Modern warfare isn't decided by superior soldiers, the veteran had explained. Better weapons don't determine outcomes either. Industrial capacity makes the difference. Bigger factories win wars. More oil wells provide victory. Larger economies crush smaller ones. Everything else becomes mere decoration. Hartmann had dismissed these words initially. Military tradition emphasized different values. Training mattered. Tactics determined success. Fighting spirit conquered all obstacles. These beliefs had shaped his entire worldview. But June 6th delivered a harsh education in economic reality. The lesson cut deep into every assumption he'd held. Consider aircraft production alone. Germany had certainly created excellent fighters. The Focke-Wulf 190 stood among the world's finest when it first appeared. Performance exceeded anything in Allied inventories. The Messerschmitt 262 jet was now entering service in pathetic numbers. This revolutionary design pointed toward the future of aerial combat. But individual weapon excellence meant nothing against overwhelming numerical superiority. Raw numbers told the brutal truth. In 1944, the United States alone manufactured over 96,000 aircraft. 96,000 individual machines rolled off American assembly lines. Germany, despite its renowned engineering expertise, produced approximately 40,000 aircraft during the same period. This wasn't a simple 2-to-1 disadvantage. Combined Allied production created closer to 4-to-1 superiority. The disparity grew even worse when considering aircraft complexity. American planes averaged larger sizes and greater sophistication than German fighters. A single B-17 bomber required more aluminum than 3 Messerschmitt 109 fighters. Manufacturing hours favored the bomber heavily. Material requirements were staggering, so the actual production gap exceeded what simple aircraft counts revealed. Pilot training created perhaps an even more critical disparity. Here, the economic foundations of warfare showed their true power. Allied nations could afford extended pilot preparation. 6 months of training was standard. Flight time reached 200 hours before combat deployment. Tactical exercises continued until responses became instinctive. Everything was drilled to perfection. Germany couldn't match this luxury. Every training flight consumed precious fuel. Each month spent in preparation meant one less month of combat availability. Training programs faced constant compression. Duration shortened repeatedly. Quality suffered inevitably. Inadequately prepared pilots died quickly in combat. Quick deaths demanded rapid replacements. More replacements stressed the training system further. A vicious cycle developed that couldn't be broken. The fuel crisis represented another manifestation of industrial weakness. Allied forces could afford massive bombing campaigns against German oil production. They possessed strategic bombers in sufficient numbers. Fighter escorts protected these bombers effectively. Fuel supplies sustained these operations indefinitely. Industrial capacity replaced losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Germany lacked any meaningful ability to strike back at Allied fuel sources. This wasn't due to lack of courage among aircrew. Skill levels remained high despite everything. The industrial foundation simply couldn't support strategic bombing operations of necessary scale. Resources always returned to the central equation. Factory output determined possibilities. Industrial capacity shaped strategic options. Economic strength trumped battlefield brilliance every single time. Sunset arrived on June 6th, bringing the first casualty reports. These preliminary numbers were absolutely staggering. Allied forces had successfully landed approximately 156,000 troops across the Normandy beaches. Beachheads were firmly established. Positions were being consolidated rapidly. All this had been accomplished with surprisingly light casualties given the operation's massive scale. German defenders had certainly fought with tremendous bravery. They inflicted significant losses on the invading forces. Individual acts of heroism were countless. Resistance had been fierce and determined. But without air support, without ability to maneuver reinforcements due to Allied air supremacy, throwing the invasion back into the sea proved impossible. The critical first day had been lost. This was when the landing forces were most vulnerable to counterattack. The opportunity would never return. The Luftwaffe's contribution to the defense had been essentially meaningless. 140 sorties against thousands of Allied flights. It represented the military equivalent of bringing a knife to a gunfight. Actually worse than that comparison suggested. 6 knives against an entire army would be more accurate. Evening shadows lengthened as Hartmann stood outside the operations building. Their new dispersal field offered little improvement over the previous location. Somewhere westward, Normandy was burning under the weight of battle. American and British forces were digging defensive positions. German defenders were dying in steadily increasing numbers. Tomorrow would bring continuation of the same pattern. More Allied troops would come ashore. More tanks would roll off landing craft. More supplies would accumulate on the beaches. Above it all, unchallenged Allied air forces would maintain complete dominance. Schmidt approached through the gathering darkness. The ground crew chief looked exhausted. His uniform showed stains from long hours of maintenance work. "Herr Hauptmann," he began quietly, "the fuel situation for tomorrow's operations. We have sufficient supplies for perhaps 4 aircraft. Maybe 5 if we're extremely careful with allocations. 4 aircraft. Yesterday the number had been 6. Tomorrow it would drop to 4. Next week might bring complete fuel exhaustion." The downward trend was unmistakable and irreversible. The Luftwaffe wasn't suffering defeat in aerial combat. Strangulation through logistics was killing them slowly. Fuel starvation prevented operations. Pilot training became impossible. Numbers that couldn't be matched overwhelmed everything else. "Understood," Hartmann replied quietly. "Ensure the 4 best aircraft receive fuel and proper preparation." Schmidt nodded acknowledgement and disappeared into the darkness. Hartmann remained alone, staring westward toward Normandy. Distant artillery provided a constant rumble. It was a battle he couldn't join despite every instinct demanding action. What Hartmann couldn't understand from his limited perspective was how the D-Day fuel crisis connected to broader strategic catastrophe. The Luftwaffe's complete inability to contest Normandy's skies traced back to decisions made years earlier. These choices now bore their bitter fruit. Germany had entered the conflict dependent on imported petroleum. 80% of oil supplies came from outside German borders. Romania provided the largest share. Strategic planners had recognized this vulnerability from the beginning, but they'd gambled everything on quick victory. Rapid conquest would provide access to resource-rich territories. The gamble had failed completely. As warfare dragged on, synthetic fuel became increasingly important. Technology existed to convert coal into aviation gasoline. The process was expensive and terribly inefficient, but it worked adequately when no alternatives remained. By 1943, synthetic fuel plants were providing the majority of German aviation fuel. These facilities became obvious targets for Allied strategic bombing. They were large installations that couldn't be hidden effectively. Their importance to German military operations was absolutely critical. When Allied forces finally prioritized attacking synthetic fuel production in May 1944, results were catastrophic for Germany. The plants couldn't be rebuilt quickly after damage. Production processes were extremely complex. Critical component destruction could shut down entire facilities for months. Allied intelligence knew exactly which components were most vital. Bombing could be precisely targeted for maximum disruption. There was brutal efficiency in this approach. Every bomb ton dropped on synthetic fuel plants was worth several tons on other targets. Fuel affected absolutely everything in modern warfare. Aircraft couldn't fly without it. Tanks couldn't move. Trucks couldn't transport supplies. Training programs ground to a halt. It represented a strategic choke point, and the Allies had squeezed it shut completely. By June 1944, Germany was producing less than one-third of required aviation fuel. By September, production would collapse to just one-tenth of minimum requirements. The Luftwaffe would never recover from this strangulation. Even as German factories continued aircraft production, output actually peaked in late 1944. There was no fuel to operate them. Hundreds of brand-new fighters sat in storage facilities, completely unused. Allied air forces bombed Germany with total impunity while perfect aircraft gathered dust. For Hartmann and thousands of fellow Luftwaffe pilots, the fuel crisis created a unique form of psychological torture. They retained their training and skills. Willingness to fight remained strong. Aircraft were often available in adequate numbers, but fuel starvation prevented any meaningful action. It was mental torment of the cruelest variety. Pilots watched their nation's defeat unfold from the ground, completely unable to intervene. Frustration levels became immense and destructive. Every pilot understood exactly what needed doing. Allied bomber formations required interception. Ground forces needed air support desperately. Allied air superiority demanded challenges. These were all tasks they'd trained for extensively. But training became meaningless without fuel for operations. Some pilots volunteered for ground combat roles. Fighting with rifles seemed preferable to sitting idle beside grounded aircraft. Others fell into deep depression and alcohol abuse. They couldn't cope with their enforced helplessness. A very few maintained morale by focusing on technical maintenance. They kept aircraft in perfect condition for fuel that might someday return. It never did return in meaningful quantities. The psychological damage extended far beyond individual pilots. The entire Luftwaffe organization, once the pride of German military might, became thoroughly demoralized. Veterans who'd flown combat missions across Poland, France, Britain, and Russia now sat helplessly while their homeland faced invasion. These were men who'd seen aerial combat across the breadth of Europe. They'd participated in the greatest air battles in history. Now they watched from the ground as their country was systematically destroyed. The contrast with 1940 was stark and deeply painful. 4 years earlier, the Luftwaffe had dominated European skies completely. Stuka dive bombers terrorized enemy ground forces. Messerschmitt fighters swept opposing aircraft from the sky. Air superiority seemed natural and permanent. Now they couldn't even protect German cities from daily bombing raids. The collapse had happened with shocking speed. In 1943, the Luftwaffe remained a formidable fighting force. By mid-1944, it had become a hollow shell of former capabilities. The pilots could see mathematical reality clearly. They understood what the numbers meant. Without adequate fuel supplies, without sufficient aircraft numbers, without air superiority, Germany would lose this war. Not might lose, but definitely would lose. It was simple arithmetic. The only remaining questions were timeline and casualty counts. June 7th dawned gray and drizzly. Weather conditions matched the mood at the dispersal field. Hartmann and his surviving pilots prepared the 4 aircraft that had received fuel allocations. 4 fighters against an Allied air armada now operating from captured airstrips in Normandy itself. The advantage gap was widening hourly. Mission briefing was painfully simple. Conduct reconnaissance flights over the battle zone. Avoid combat engagement unless absolutely necessary for survival. Return immediately if confronted by superior enemy forces. In other words, fly over the area, observe enemy movements, and run away if threatened. It was completely contrary to aggressive fighter tactics German pilots had learned. But reality dictated new approaches. 4 aircraft with no prospect of reinforcement couldn't achieve anything through traditional combat methods. The 4 fighters departed at 7 in the morning. They returned 3 hours later, having accomplished absolutely nothing except confirming what everyone already knew. Allied forces were steadily consolidating their beachhead positions. More troops and equipment came ashore every single hour. The sky was absolutely thick with Allied aircraft of every description. Over the following days and weeks, the same pattern repeated endlessly. A handful of reconnaissance sorties achieved minimal intelligence value. Steady attrition reduced even these limited capabilities. By month's end, the Luftwaffe had effectively surrendered air superiority over France completely. German ground forces continued fighting with stubborn determination. They defended every hedgerow and village with fierce resistance. Individual acts of heroism were common and inspiring. But without air cover, their strategic position was completely hopeless. Allied fighter bombers roamed freely across the battlefield. Any vehicle movement during daylight hours faced immediate destruction. German reinforcements could only move at night, dramatically slowing their arrival at critical points. Supply convoys were devastated from the air before reaching frontline units. Artillery positions were spotted and bombed before firing more than a few salvos. The mathematical superiority so evident on D-Day extended throughout the entire Normandy campaign. For every German tank destroyed, Allied forces brought up 3 replacements. For every German soldier killed, replacements landed from the endless stream of supply ships. For every German aircraft shot down, 10 Allied planes took its place. Hartmann flew occasionally when fuel became available. He survived through a combination of flying skill, pure luck, and extreme caution. But every flight confirmed his growing understanding. He was surviving in a completely lost cause. Allied superiority wasn't just significant, it was overwhelming to the point where German resistance merely delayed inevitable outcomes without changing fundamental results. In the post-war years, historians would endlessly debate reasons for Germany's defeat. Some would emphasize tactical mistakes made at crucial moments. Others focused on strategic blunders by high command. Political decisions would receive extensive analysis. But for those who understood economic fundamentals, the answer was always crystal clear. Germany lost the air war because it lost the production war first. The numbers were stark and completely unforgiving. In 1944, United States aircraft production exceeded the combined output of Germany, Britain, and Italy together. Not just fighter aircraft, but everything. Bombers, transport aircraft, training planes, everything that flew. The sheer scale of American production was unprecedented in human history. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant could complete one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. One complete four-engine heavy bomber rolled off the assembly line every hour. That single factory's output exceeded entire monthly production runs of some German aircraft types. And Willow Run was just one facility among dozens of similar plants. Americans had transformed their automotive industry into aviation production without significantly disrupting civilian life. American citizens at home still owned cars, still enjoyed consumer goods, still maintained comfortable lives by wartime standards. Germany strained every fiber of industrial capacity just to keep pace, and it wasn't keeping pace at all. Even at peak production in late 1944, German factories couldn't approach Allied output levels. The industrial foundation simply wasn't adequate for the task. Then fuel became the decisive factor. The United States possessed vast domestic oil fields across Texas, Oklahoma, and California. American forces could fuel not only their own massive military operations, but also supply huge quantities to Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease programs. Germany enjoyed no such advantages. Every gallon of aviation fuel required synthesis from coal or importation from increasingly vulnerable Romanian sources. Once Allied bombing campaigns targeted these facilities systematically, the strategic game was over completely. Training represented another area where economic factors determined final outcomes. Training pilots costs enormous amounts of money, time, and fuel. Every training flight burns precious gasoline. Practice dogfights consume ammunition stocks. Combat exercises require maintenance support. Allied nations could afford comprehensive 6-month training programs. Germany couldn't sustain such luxury. So Allied pilots entered combat with twice the preparation time and vastly more flight experience. They survived initial combat longer. They achieved more aerial victories. They required fewer replacement pilots. It created another virtuous cycle for Allied forces and a death spiral for Germany. Better training produced better pilots. Better pilots lived longer in combat. Longer-lived pilots became experienced veterans. Experienced veterans could effectively train the next generation of pilots. Meanwhile, Germany produced inadequately trained pilots who died quickly in combat. Quick deaths required more replacements, straining training systems further. This produced even less adequate pilots in an ever-worsening cycle. Mathematics doesn't care about courage, determination, or fighting spirit. 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of personal bravery or cowardice. The mathematics of industrial warfare said Germany couldn't win this conflict. Not with available resources, not with existing production capacity, not with fuel supplies collapsing. By June 6, 1944, the final conclusion was mathematically predetermined. The only remaining question was how long mathematical certainty would take to manifest on battlefields. Franz Hartmann survived the war through skill and incredible luck. He flew his final combat mission in December 1944, when fuel shortages became so severe that even reconnaissance flights were extremely rare. His last sortie was completely typical of the Luftwaffe's dying months: limited fuel, obsolete tactics, overwhelming enemy superiority on all levels. He took off with 3 other fighters, flew for 90 minutes, observed dozens of Allied aircraft, carefully avoided any combat engagement, and returned having accomplished absolutely nothing of military value. After landing, he received immediate notification that no more aviation fuel was available at the field. His aircraft would be towed to a dispersal area and camouflaged against air attacks. Perhaps more fuel would arrive next week. Perhaps not. Nobody could make any promises. The fuel never arrived in usable quantities. That December flight was his final time in the air. In January 1945, Hartmann's entire unit received transfer to airfield defense duties. Fighter pilots became infantry soldiers, defending airstrips that lacked fuel to operate any aircraft. The bitter irony escaped nobody's attention. In April 1945, as Allied ground forces advanced deep into Germany itself, Hartmann's unit surrendered without firing a single defensive shot. There was nothing left worth defending. No aircraft, no fuel, no realistic hope. After the war's end, during interrogation by Allied intelligence officers, Hartmann was asked when he first knew Germany had lost the war. His answer came immediately, without any hesitation. June 6, 1944, at 4:15 in the morning, when I received notification that we had fuel for only 6 aircraft. The intelligence officer appeared puzzled by this response. Surely there had been earlier warning signs, he suggested. The Eastern Front defeats were significant. Strategic bombing campaigns had been devastating. The loss of North Africa was clearly important. Hartmann shook his head firmly. Those were military defeats, he explained. June 6th was completely different. That was the exact moment I understood we weren't just losing individual battles. We were losing the entire war itself, because the fundamental difference wasn't about tactics or military leadership. It was about fuel, steel, production capacity, industrial factors that personal courage couldn't overcome through any amount of determination. I knew that morning that we were fighter pilots trapped in a war that would be decided by factory output, and their factories were simply bigger than ours. The intelligence officer carefully noted this assessment and moved to other questions. But Hartmann's evaluation would prove remarkably prescient. In comprehensive post-war studies, historians identified the oil campaign as one of 3 most decisive factors in Germany's ultimate defeat, alongside Soviet manpower and Allied industrial production. Hartmann returned to Germany in 1947 after prisoner processing. He never flew aircraft again for the remainder of his life. He couldn't bring himself to enter any airplane after the war's end. The psychological association with frustration, with complete impotence, with watching defeat unfold helplessly from the ground, was simply too powerful and traumatic. He found work in construction, helping rebuild the German cities that bombing campaigns had systematically destroyed. He rarely spoke about wartime experiences to anyone. When younger generations asked what it was like being a Luftwaffe pilot, his response was always the same. We had adequate training, we had decent aircraft, we didn't have sufficient fuel. That's the complete story. The story of June 6, 1944, from the Luftwaffe perspective, is ultimately a story about the fundamental nature of modern industrial warfare. It demonstrates how manufacturing capacity matters more than individual courage. It shows how logistics determines strategic outcomes more than battlefield tactics. It proves how resource production shapes strategic possibilities more than battlefield brilliance or tactical innovation. The German pilots at Creel Airfield that morning weren't cowards by any measure. They weren't incompetent or poorly prepared by contemporary standards. They weren't inadequately trained for their era. They were military professionals who found themselves on the wrong side of an industrial equation they couldn't solve through flying skill or personal bravery. The Allied invasion succeeded not primarily because Allied soldiers fought more bravely or Allied generals displayed superior tactical cleverness. Success came because Allied factories produced more of everything: more aircraft, more fuel, more ammunition, more replacement equipment, more everything needed for sustained warfare. This production advantage, built systematically over years, proved decisive within hours of the invasion's beginning. For every German fighter that managed to get airborne on D-Day, 40 Allied aircraft filled the sky. This wasn't a tactical disparity that could be overcome through better flying techniques. This was industrial dominance, and industrial dominance, once firmly established, becomes almost impossible to overcome through battlefield actions alone. The brutal mathematics of warfare Leave no room for hope when the numbers are stacked against you. No army can survive when enemies replace their losses 10 times faster. No force can maneuver when fuel runs out, while opponents operate without limits. The arithmetic becomes merciless. German pilots discovered this harsh reality in the most crushing way imaginable. They learned it sitting next to aircraft that worked perfectly but couldn't leave the ground. They watched their homeland face invasion while possessing every skill needed for defense, every capability except the fuel to use it. They experienced something uniquely devastating: defeat through starvation rather than battle. Their story carries deeper meaning than tales of dogfights and aerial victories. It reveals fundamental truths about warfare between industrial powers. Modern wars get decided in assembly plants and oil refineries long before armies clash. The nation with superior industrial muscle can stumble and suffer defeats, yet still crush opponents through raw material weight. Germany's fuel shortage on D-Day represented the peak achievement of a bombing strategy that many Allied commanders had questioned. Numerous military experts doubted bombing could change war outcomes decisively. Assembly lines could restart after raids, production facilities could scatter to new locations, damage could get repaired quickly. The doubters insisted only infantry could win wars. The oil offensive proved them completely wrong. Bombs couldn't seize ground or hold territory, but bombs could eliminate the fuel that kept armies moving. Without energy, even mighty military machines become useless hunks of metal. The fuel campaign showed brilliant planning and ruthless execution. Allied strategists pinpointed Germany's reliance on artificial fuel as a fatal weakness. They created targeting systems to exploit this vulnerability completely. They assigned bomber squadrons to carry out the mission. They maintained pressure through casualties and setbacks until achieving total success. The results appeared clearly in Normandy skies that June morning. German aviators with empty fuel tanks, German armor without diesel for movement, German supply trucks lacking gasoline for transport, an entire war machine grinding to silence. Not from lack of weapons, but absence of energy. Strategic bombing achieved its greatest triumph here, not the most dramatic victory. City destruction generated bigger headlines, not the most spectacular success. Burning refineries didn't create stunning newsreel footage like other targets, but the most decisive achievement. Every gallon denied to Germany was worth more than tons of explosives dropped anywhere else. The Allies understood this completely. By September 1944, oil installations became the highest bombing priority. Everything else took second place. Aircraft plants and bearing factories and even direct ground support became secondary concerns. Fuel targets took precedence because they affected everything simultaneously. Destroy energy production and mobility dies. Kill mobility and operational ability vanishes. Eliminate operational capability and victory becomes inevitable. Luftwaffe pilots grounded that morning became casualties of strategic thinking they probably never knew existed. Brave men rendered powerless by targeting decisions made in distant planning rooms. War researchers later assembled detailed statistics about the Normandy operation. The numbers painted Allied superiority with crystal clarity. D-Day itself saw Allied forces fly 14,674 combat missions. The Luftwaffe managed just 319. During the week following invasion, as Allied troops secured their foothold, the gap widened dramatically. Allied missions numbered in tens of thousands every day. German flights rarely reached 100 total. By late June, the Luftwaffe had effectively vanished as a combat force in France. Fuel production numbers told an equally stark story. March 1944 saw Germany produce 180,000 tons of aviation fuel. June production dropped to 56,000 tons. September would see only 20,000 tons manufactured. Meanwhile, consumption exceeded production every single month without exception. Germany was burning through stockpiled reserves while operating on borrowed time. Every mission flown depleted supplies that couldn't be replaced. The situation was completely unsustainable and could only end one way. Pilot casualties completed this picture of total collapse. May 1944 alone cost the Luftwaffe 489 trained fighter pilots killed or severely wounded. Training schools produced only 396 replacements during that same period. Germany was losing experienced aviators faster than new ones could be trained. The replacements received merely 60 hours of flight instruction compared to 225 hours for Allied pilots. The skill difference was enormous and growing. Veteran German pilots represented irreplaceable assets built over years of combat experience. When they died, which happened increasingly as they faced impossible odds, their loss couldn't be compensated by inadequately trained teenagers thrust into cockpits. The Luftwaffe was simultaneously shrinking in size while declining in quality, losing numbers and capability at the same time. Tank production comparisons showed identical industrial disparities. The United States built over 29,000 tanks during 1944. Germany produced approximately 19,000 tanks. But American armor arrived with abundant fuel, spare parts, and complete logistical support. German tanks often sat motionless for want of diesel fuel. A tank without energy becomes nothing more than an expensive concrete bunker. The Allies could afford losing 3 medium tanks for every German Panther they destroyed. They had 10 more mediums waiting behind those 3 losses. Germany possessed no such luxury of numbers. Every destroyed Panther represented permanent loss that couldn't be replaced within any reasonable time frame. These statistics, compiled coldly after war's end, confirmed what Hartmann had sensed that June morning. This wasn't a contest between roughly equal forces where tactics and courage would determine outcomes. This was a complete mismatch between industrial giants and a resource-starved nation. The final result was never truly in doubt once Allied production reached full capacity. Throughout summer 1944, as Allied armies broke out from Normandy beaches and swept across France, the Luftwaffe remained notably absent from the skies above. German soldiers fighting on the ground developed bitter hatred toward their own air force. They couldn't understand why no air cover protected them. They knew nothing about fuel shortages or pilot training failures. They only knew that looking up revealed nothing but Allied aircraft, and those aircraft made their existence pure hell. Every daylight movement got spotted and bombed immediately. Every troop concentration drew devastating strikes. Every supply convoy became a target for destruction. Fighting without air protection, German ground forces learned, was like fighting with both arms tied behind your back. Theoretically possible, but practically impossible against competent enemies. The psychological damage was severe and lasting. German morale, which had stayed relatively strong through earlier defeats, began cracking completely. Fighting and losing battles was one thing. Fighting while enemy aircraft circled overhead untouchable, dealing death at will, was something else entirely. The feeling of complete helplessness ate away at resolve. For Luftwaffe personnel watching from airfields, the experience cut even deeper. They possessed aircraft in good condition. They had pilots ready to fight. They maintained the will for combat. They lacked only fuel. That single missing element made everything else completely meaningless. It represented a unique form of psychological torture. Picture being a master chef without any ingredients, a skilled surgeon lacking medical supplies, a dedicated teacher with no students to instruct. Professional capability rendered totally useless by absence of one critical resource. Some Luftwaffe ground crews, watching Allied aircraft fly overhead completely unchallenged, suffered emotional breakdowns. Years of intensive training wasted. Thousands of hours maintaining aircraft for nothing, all because fuel trucks no longer made deliveries to airfields. The airfields themselves became bizarre, almost surreal places. Perfectly maintained aircraft, lined up in protective shelters, fully armed and mission-ready. Propellers completely still, engines cold and silent. like museum displays of a military force that once existed but was now just memory. Occasionally, when tiny amounts of fuel could be gathered from various sources, a single aircraft might actually fly. One lonely fighter making token appearance over battlefields dominated by hundreds of enemy aircraft. The pilot would take off knowing the mission was completely pointless. Symbolic at best, suicidal at worst. But they flew anyway because the alternative, admitting total impotence, was psychologically unbearable for warriors. These flights accomplished absolutely nothing from tactical standpoint. But they mattered enormously from psychological perspective. They were reminders, however futile, that the Luftwaffe still existed in some form. That German pilots hadn't surrendered completely, even when their situation appeared hopeless. By December 1944, the fuel situation had deteriorated beyond any possibility of recovery. Production had fallen to levels that couldn't sustain even minimal flight operations. The Luftwaffe made one final desperate effort during the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in Western Europe. For this operation, fuel reserves were completely hoarded. Training was suspended entirely. Every available drop of aviation fuel got allocated to support ground offensive operations. The result was Operation Bodenplatte. A New Year's Day, 1945, surprise attack on Allied airfields. The Luftwaffe gathered every aircraft capable of flight, every pilot still breathing and conscious. They threw everything into one massive surprise assault. Nearly 1,000 German fighters participated in the operation. It was the largest Luftwaffe mission in many months. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise initially, destroyed several hundred Allied aircraft sitting on runways. For a few brief hours, it seemed like old times had returned. German fighters roaming through Allied airspace striking targets at will. But the success proved fleeting and ultimately meaningless. The fuel expended in that single operation represented months of carefully hoarded reserves. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 300 pilots in the mission, including many experienced officers who were absolutely irreplaceable. The Allies replaced their destroyed aircraft within mere days. The lost planes were barely noticed or missed. The operation's ultimate failure illustrated everything wrong with Germany's strategic position at that point. Even when the Luftwaffe could gather significant forces for one major operation, they couldn't sustain that effort beyond a single day. The fuel used for Bodenplatte left absolutely nothing for follow-up operations. Training remained completely suspended. Defensive operations over Germany suffered accordingly, all for an attack that the Allies dismissed and recovered from within 72 hours. After Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe essentially ceased existing as any kind of organized fighting force. Individual aircraft still managed to fly occasionally. Scattered units still fought when possible. But coordinated air operations were completely finished. The fuel was simply gone forever. January and February 1945 saw fuel production fall below 10,000 tons monthly. That was sufficient to fly perhaps 1,000 individual sorties, across all of Germany combined. For an air force that once flew tens of thousands of sorties every month, the end had finally arrived. Not through decisive defeat in aerial combat, but through slow strangulation by fuel shortage that made flight impossible. In April 1945, American ground forces overran Creel airfield during their advance through Germany. What they discovered there stood as testament to the fuel crisis that had completely crippled the Luftwaffe. Dozens of aircraft sat in perfect operating condition, fully armed with ammunition and weapons. Completely untouched by any combat damage, they had simply never flown for lack of fuel to power their engines. American intelligence officers interviewed the German ground crew personnel stationed there. The stories they heard confirmed exactly what Allied bombing assessments had predicted. The oil campaign had worked precisely as intended by strategic planners. One ground crew chief told his American interrogators a story that summarized everything. "We could have fought effectively. We wanted to fight desperately. We had excellent aircraft and brave pilots ready for combat, but we had no fuel whatsoever. For months we watched the Allies bomb Germany systematically, while our fighters sat on the ground completely unable to help defend our country. The American officer asked why the aircraft hadn't been moved elsewhere, dispersed to other locations, hidden from bombing attacks. The chief laughed with bitter irony at the question. Hidden where exactly? Move them how? We had no fuel to fly them anywhere. No trucks with fuel to tow them to safety. They sat exactly where they were positioned, because there was absolutely no other option available. Similar scenes played out across Germany as Allied forces advanced through the country. Airfields crowded with unused aircraft, hangars filled with spare parts and equipment, storage facilities packed with ammunition and weapons, everything except the fuel needed to make it all functional. The Luftwaffe's death had come through resource starvation rather than combat defeat. Allied intelligence teams compiled extensive, detailed reports on the fuel situation they discovered. The conclusions completely vindicated the oil campaign's strategic concept and execution. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe couldn't train new pilots properly, couldn't maintain sustained combat operations, couldn't contest air superiority battles, couldn't provide ground support for army units. The entire military structure collapsed from this single critical deficiency. One captured Luftwaffe officer, when asked what might have changed the war's outcome, replied with simple directness, "Double our fuel production and we fight for another full year. Triple it and perhaps we survive long enough for political changes to occur." But the Allies controlled fuel production through their systematic bombing campaign. Once they targeted oil facilities, our defeat became mathematical certainty rather than military possibility. This was perhaps the most important lesson from the Luftwaffe's wartime experience. Modern military forces are utterly dependent on fuel for everything they do. Training consumes fuel constantly. Operations consume fuel continuously. Logistics consume fuel relentlessly. Cut off the fuel supply and everything stops functioning. Not immediately, but inevitably and completely. The Luftwaffe in June 1944 was a preview of its own inevitable future. Grounded aircraft gathering dust. Frustrated pilots unable to fly. Helpless rage at being unable to contest battles being lost overhead. In the decades since World War II ended, military historians have extensively analyzed the factors that determined the war's ultimate outcome. The Luftwaffe's defeat in the air war features prominently in these detailed analyses. Most historians agree on several key points that emerge from the evidence. First, numerical superiority mattered far more than technological excellence in determining outcomes. German aircraft were often superior designs technically. The FW-190 fighter, the Me-262 jet, the advanced fighters of 1944 and 1945 were formidable weapons systems, but they existed in completely insufficient numbers for strategic impact. The Allies could afford losing 3 mediocre fighters for every excellent German fighter they destroyed, because they had 10 more mediocre fighters behind those 3 losses. Germany didn't possess that numerical luxury. Second, resource availability determined operational capability far more than tactical skill levels. German pilots, particularly experienced veterans, were often more skilled individually than their Allied counterparts. But skill meant absolutely nothing when you couldn't take off for lack of fuel. A grounded ace pilot was worth less than a mediocre pilot who could actually fly missions. Third, industrial production capacity was the foundational factor that determined everything else in the war effort. More production meant more aircraft available, more fuel for operations, more ammunition for combat, better logistics for support, longer training for quality, higher quality pilots overall. Less production meant shortages everywhere, rationing of critical supplies, inadequate training periods, declining capability across the board. The Allies outproduced Germany by margins that made tactical and operational levels of war almost irrelevant to final outcomes. Fourth, strategic bombing, when properly targeted at critical vulnerabilities, could decisively affect war outcomes. The oil campaign proved that bombing could accomplish more than destroying factories or terrorizing civilian populations. It could strike directly at the jugular of an industrial war machine, its energy supply system, and bring the entire military structure crashing down completely. These lessons shaped post-war military thinking profoundly. They influenced Cold War strategy development. They informed decisions about resource dependency and strategic vulnerability assessment. And they all trace directly back to mornings like June 6, 1944, when German pilots stood beside grounded aircraft completely unable to contest an invasion, because their nation's fuel production had been systematically destroyed by enemy bombing campaigns over many months. Franz Hartmann's assessment that June 6, 1944 at 4:15 a.m. was the moment he knew Germany had lost the war was more than one man's individual perspective. It represented a broader truth about the nature of the war by 1944. The outcome had been decided not by that morning's events specifically, but by years of industrial competition that Germany had definitively lost. The Allies hadn't just invaded Normandy beaches that day. They had constructed the complete industrial capacity to make invasion possible. They had built the ships for transport, trained the troops for combat, produced the aircraft for support, refined the fuel for operations, manufactured the ammunition for fighting, everything required for successful invasion. And they had accomplished all this while simultaneously fighting in Italy, supporting the Soviet Union with supplies, conducting strategic bombing of Germany, and fighting a completely separate war against Japan in the Pacific Ocean. The scale of Allied, particularly American, industrial mobilization was unprecedented in human history. Germany, fighting essentially alone after Italy's collapse, couldn't match it, wasn't even close to matching it. The disparity was so enormous that tactical and operational excellence, areas where Germany often maintained advantages, couldn't overcome strategic industrial inferiority. For Luftwaffe pilots grounded that morning, this represented a profound psychological defeat. They were warriors made irrelevant by economics, professionals rendered impotent by resource shortages, men with complete will to fight but lacking the means to do so. In final analysis, June 6, 1944 wasn't primarily a story of beaches and paratroopers and naval bombardment. Those were the visible, dramatic elements that captured public attention. The decisive element was completely invisible to observers. It was in German fuel tanks that weren't being filled, in aircraft that couldn't take off from airfields, in pilots who could only watch as skies filled with enemy aircraft flying unopposed. The Allies won D-Day not in a single day of fighting on beaches, but through years of industrial preparation that gave them overwhelming material superiority before the battle began. By June 6th, the question wasn't whether they would establish a secure beachhead in France. The question was only how quickly it would be accomplished, because the Luftwaffe, which should have been Germany's primary means of contesting the invasion, was already defeated. Not destroyed in aerial combat, but defeated by fuel shortages, grounded completely, helpless to affect the outcome of the most important battle on the Western Front. That was the real story of D-Day from the German perspective, not a story of combat defeat in battle, but of industrial strangulation over time, not a tale of warriors overwhelmed by superior opponents, but of warriors rendered irrelevant by circumstances. Not a battle lost through inferior tactics, but a war already decided by factors beyond the control of men who would have to fight it. When Hartmann stood on the tarmac at Creel that morning and was told there was fuel for only 6 aircraft, he was witnessing the final verdict of industrial warfare. The side with more factories, more oil wells, more resources would win decisively. Everything else was just details and final formalities. And in June 1944, against the full weight of Allied industrial might, Germany's defeat was no longer a question requiring analysis. It was only a matter of time before the inevitable end arrived.